Today, we're talking about why you should hold cash and how much you should have on hand. We'll also cover the emergency fund, along with any extra cash that you should consider on top of that. We'll also go through an example to show you how this would actually play out in real life. First off, why do you need cash? Why do you have to hold cash? Well, in general, you should hold enough cash to do three things: cover unexpected emergencies, pay for your monthly expenses, and then meet any short-term goals. If you pay for all your expenses with credit cards, which I do, you may wonder why you need cash considering you can pay for anything unexpected on a credit card. The reason that you need the cash though is if you don't have the cash set aside to pay off your credit cards each month, you're then banking on future income to cover these bills. And that right there is how the downward spiral of debt begins. For this reason, it's important to keep some money in cash for these three reasons: regular expenses like your mortgage or rent, groceries, and credit card bills; emergency funds that in case something happens that's really large and unexpected that comes up out of nowhere; and savings for big expenses in the next few years, like a down payment, for example. Some people may ask why they need cash at all. Why not just invest everything and then rely on your investments for emergencies, right? You can just borrow from those or withdraw your funds. Well, take it from me. The global equity market can be volatile, so you really shouldn't invest 100% of your savings if you need some of it for your short-term expenses. If all your savings are in the market, you're putting your short-term finances at risk, at some serious risk actually, if the market goes down. And if you would have had a large expense invested, let's say in the market, for example, early 2020, right when COVID hit, you would have been down almost 32% just a few months later by late March. This would have put your ability to pay for that big expense in jeopardy. The global market is super unpredictable. Don't leave cash in the market that you might need in the next few years. And since we never know when the market might be going down, having cash is important. How much cash should you have on hand? First off, necessary or fixed expenses. You need to make sure that you take care of your immediate needs first. This is the food, shelter, transportation, internet, cell phone bill, utilities. These expenses allow you to live your life in a reasonable manner. You don't need that nice dinner out, right? But you do need to have enough money to buy groceries for the next week and the next month. I like to have multiple bank accounts so I don't just leave all of my paychecks sitting in my main checking account, right? And then I'm tempted to spend it if it's all sitting there. Now, most people will spend that money as well if they just see it every day. However, you should leave the amount of money that covers these necessary expenses in your main bank account if that's what you use for these expenses. Calculate the amount that you might need to cover these expenses for the next month or so. And then don't let your cash balance in your main checking account or main cash account go below that threshold. If you're having trouble estimating that number, just make a conservative estimate and add a little cushion to that amount. This step is key to avoid going into debt. All right, emergency funds. This is the next part. Once you set aside those monthly expenses, you need to set aside the emergency fund. An emergency fund, we've talked about it before on this channel, is money set aside in cash to cover unexpected expenses before allocating money for anything else. This is cash savings. Again, cash savings, not investments, that can be accessed immediately if you lose your job or experience some kind of large expense. You want your liquidity to be high. You can access it right away, right? You want this liquid and easily accessible, and it will ideally keep you out of debt and facing even more consequences down the road. Emergency savings is the first step to building your financial future, and it should come, honestly, even before you start investing. I know not everyone wants to hear that. Before you start investing, you gotta have your emergency fund set up. Everyone needs an emergency fund, whether you're wealthy or not. This is important. It's hard to predict when or if you'll even need emergency savings to cover your living expenses, largely because this cash reserve is specifically for the unexpected. Even the most careful planners can lose their job or experience some unusual healthcare costs, for example, that put them in a tight financial position. So, to figure out this emergency savings number, total up what you spend in an average month. Multiply that number by at least 3. I suggest honestly doing 6 to be safe, and then use that as your starting point. You can do this through a simple Google sheet to get started. That's personally how I do it. Set your emergency fund aside in some kind of cash account so you're not tempted to spend this. Don't leave it in the same account as your main spending checking account. Ideally, you should pick an account that earns more interest than what you get in your traditional checking account as well. If you're risk averse, meaning that you like to be overcautious, there's no harm in saving more than that standard rule of thumb, 3 to 6 months worth of savings here. It's okay if you have 7, 8, 9 months worth of savings. And we've talked about this as well. While an excess emergency fund can certainly eat away at your long-term returns due to inflation, sometimes the peace of mind is more important than the math. Numbers might not always matter here. Don't feel guilty putting away excess cash or adjusting your strategy over time as you start a family or experience big life changes. Never hurts to have a little cushion of cash right here. And the third key piece is having enough cash for short-term goals. This amount is entirely dependent on the major expenses that you have planned for the next 3 to 5 years. You don't want to invest the funds needed in this time frame, 3 to 5 years, so you want to set aside the cash in a checking or some kind of savings account that gets you some interest. For me, we're still putting more money into our home, and now that we bought a second home, and therefore rely upon this bucket for these purposes. Another big question we always ask, should I pay off debt or should I save? This one, I talk to friends about this all the time. And this answer comes down to the interest rate that the debt is charging. If it's high, pay this off right away. Pay it off ASAP. But if that interest rate that the debt is charging is low, let's say anything under 4% or so, you may consider prioritizing saving over paying off that debt. Most of us think about credit card debt when we say debt, but really, debt comes in many forms, and it's important to understand how each type of debt impacts you personally. I like to organize it by interest rate, starting with the highest interest rate first, and then decide how I want to pay it down from there. This method, starting with the highest interest rate first, is called the avalanche method. Credit card debt typically carries the highest interest rate of all kinds of debt. The key here is that you only actually pay interest on credit card debt if you don't pay off your balance each month and let it roll over to the next. If you're paying it off in full every single month, setting up automatic payments, you never have to worry about that, then you don't pay interest. But let's say you spend a little too much one month, we've all been there, carry over that balance to the next month, I've been there, then all of a sudden, you're thousands of dollars in debt. I've been there too. If you carry any credit card debt, start by paying this off first. This does not mean you should just ignore the rest of your debt though. Instead, you want to continue to make the regular payments on all the other types of debt. But now, prioritize paying down this credit card debt first. After credit card debt comes any other high interest debt, like maybe a personal loan or a debt consolidation loan that you had to pay off your credit card. I'd consider any rate over 4, 5, 6%, it's not a clear-cut number here, as a high interest rate, and then these typically fall into that category. You should prioritize making extra payments on these types of loans to take care of these after really prioritizing the credit card debt. So again, you're not putting these off and not making zero payments. You're just prioritizing credit card debt first and then the high interest rate next. Next, we can focus on the lower interest rate debt like student loans, auto loans, or even your mortgage if you own a home. If you have any extra cash to take chunks off the principal balance on any of these types of loans after taking care of the high interest debt, do that next. Now, don't prioritize the lower interest debt over the high interest debt, but instead, just use what's maybe left over to take these on. If you have debt that's a really low interest rate, which I'd consider anything below 4%, and you're okay with having debt, you may consider just making normal payments here and saving the rest as part of your savings strategy. Again, you make normal payments, but don't make excess payments than what's required. All right, back to those cash savings. Where should I keep my cash? A few different answers here. First of all, for daily expenses, you don't want any restrictions on this account that you use to pay bills each month. So you should not keep this in a traditional savings account that limits you to that 6 transactions per month. Instead, keep this cash in a cash account or bank account that has no restrictions, ideally a checking account that also pays higher interest. Wealthfront's cash account offers just that, no restrictions and higher interest rates than the traditional bank checking accounts. And while we're at it, hit that subscribe button. Emergency savings or short-term goals is the next category. You need these in high-yield savings or cash accounts. Now, I get it. They might not pay enough interest to beat inflation this year or even next year or for a while. I get that. But they're FDIC insured and the safest place to put cash. I only keep a small amount in a few of these accounts to ensure the account is not closed, in hopes that the interest rates might rise again soon. The bank with the best rate changes pretty much daily, and most comparison sites prioritize whoever pays them the most. So you can't always rely on those. 2 important things to keep in mind here though. Number 1, an extra 0.1% on $10,000 only adds up to $10 a year. So depending on your balance, it might be better to focus on whatever bank is most convenient or offers the features that you need. For me, Wealthfront makes it fast to transfer to my investment account from my cash account. So I like that. And then number two, you don't earn interest while your money is in transit going between banks. So chasing the best rate might actually hurt you. For these reasons, I'm not a huge fan of rate chasing and prefer to keep my cash savings where I have the most flexibility and the most features to use. I don't like restrictions on my cash. All right, let's go through an example of how much to save. Let's say your annual salary is $100,000, you live in California, and your total withholdings amount to about 30%, let's say, from each paycheck. Each paycheck you receive in your bank account totaling to $6,000 per month. How much of your total monthly income should go to cash savings in this example? Let's first assume you have a student loan payment of $500 per month. You also pay $2,000 in rent, you have a car payment of $200 per month, and you spend about another $800 per month on miscellaneous expenses like restaurants, cell phone plans, and utilities. This means you spend about $3,500 per month. Your first step is to keep an average balance in your primary bank account, right, from which you pay your credit card bills or from which you spend, however you do it, at that number, $3,500. So start there. Now, how much of the extra cash should go towards savings? We suggest saving 3 to 6 months worth of your expenses in your emergency fund, which amounts to, in this example, anywhere between $10,500 to $21,000. If you don't have any emergency savings today, start with the lower number, that $10K, and then work your way up from there. Don't be discouraged if you feel like this is too hard to get to. In this case, you still have $2,500 to work with, so I'd suggest putting away at least half of that each month into your emergency fund. Now, how much should go towards short-term goals? In this example, you still have $1,250 to set aside each month. If you're risk adverse and you like to take the conservative route here, put all of this excess cash in your emergency savings to help prepare for that upcoming vacation, that future wedding, or whatever it is in the next few years. If you like taking a bit more risk, you might consider investing this $1,250 instead of putting it away as savings. I get it, that goes against what we talked about earlier, but this is for the people who like to take risk. If you're in the middle like most of us, maybe in between, split it up evenly between your excess savings and your investing. Either way, you're taking an important step to building your safety net and your long-term wealth. All right, saving versus investing. What do? For money you don't anticipate needing to touch for years and years, let's say over 3 to 5 years, you gotta invest those funds. When you're planning for long-term goals like retirement, your kids' college, whatever other cool future plans you aren't planning for years, or even better for decades, it's best done through investing. A longer timeline, we say at least 3 to 5 years, gives your money time to rebound from any short-term market bumps, which you've seen recently, which, as always, is a given when it comes to investing. Imagine that you want to spend $20,000 on your wedding in 6 months, so you stick that much in a diversified portfolio until you need it. Well, unfortunately, the market dips right before the big day, and you end up charging to your credit card to cover the difference between your investment portfolio's value and the cost of the wedding. Even though the dip in your portfolio's value is likely temporary, right? It'll likely come up, what we've seen in the history of the market. You still didn't have the cash you needed at the moment, right when you needed it. That's why cash savings in those examples is super important. For a near-term expense, so we say anything less than 3 years or so, put those funds that you'll need into a high-yield cash account, like the Wealthfront Cash Account. This is the better plan than investing that and taking on too much risk. Investing is where you can really start to build your wealth by making your money work for you, especially through compounding. The average annual return from a globally diversified portfolio over the last 50 years is right around 8% or so. So you might look at that as your benchmark. If you compare the rate that you're paying on debt to the rate that you might expect long-term from investing, for some people, it might make sense to choose to invest instead of paying off that debt. For example, if you have a student loan charging you 3%, but you can put your extra savings that you don't need in the next few years to work, investing, and then potentially making double that, let's say at least, you might consider investing over paying off that 3% debt. However, if you have credit card debt charging you 20% or so, you're not going to beat that investing most of the time. Trust me, even if you did, long term, you're likely not going to get over 20% per year. So you want to prioritize that debt first. We have more videos on this, and we'll link that below. When thinking about what to invest in for younger investors, it can make sense to have the majority of your investments in low-cost ETFs, broadly diversified across the global market. If you want to take on more risk and buy some cryptocurrency or individual stocks, that totally makes sense, so I get that. Just make sure you understand beforehand that the more you veer away from this diversified low-cost investment methodology, kind of the classic model of passive investing, the higher chance that you might lose money. I'm not saying you're going to lose money, it's just you're increasing the likelihood that you might lose money. Investing is all about understanding the risk versus reward relationship, and no two people have the same risk tolerance. And while we're talking about it, with investing, the biggest factor here is time. The younger you are, the more time you have to let your investments compound and grow. Don't put off investing those extra savings until next week or next month. Every day you sit on the sidelines, you might miss out on some long-term returns. I'm Tony from Wealthfront. Hit subscribe and follow us. Thanks for joining. Take care.